As a player, you love your character. And as your dungeon master or game master, I love your character too. And I want to tell an amazing story involving your character with you. Backstory can be one great element of storytelling, but far too often, particularly with new players, I see them write an absolute novel for a backstory. And the problem with this is that it can actually end up hindering your experience and make it harder for both your DM and you to maximize your fun at the gaming table. My name is Robert Peake. As part of the Spontaneous Dungeon Master series of videos, I've been helping fellow DMs for years now to be more confident showing up in their games. But in this series of videos, I want to help you, the players. And I want to give you insights into what makes us Dungeon Masters happy. Because I think fundamentally, most players really want their DMs to be happy. It leads to a more fun game. It leads to players being invited back. It prevents DM burnout. And, ultimately, we all want to have fun at the gaming table. I think some players just don't know exactly how to go about it or haven't necessarily peeked inside the head of a DM. So that's what I want to give to you in this series of videos. And indeed, it is a series. So be sure to subscribe if that sounds at all interesting to you. I'll be putting these out regularly. And by the way, DMs, this might be a subtle or not so subtle way to, drop a hint to your players about what works for you. Backstory, as I said, can be a really invaluable tool in storytelling. But in this video, I want to tell you specifically what the elements are that are most important to bring out and help you avoid some of the pitfalls I've seen with backstory to make your backstory work for you, for your dungeon master, and for everyone at the gaming table. So when we start talking about game prep in general, one of the things I really like to emphasize, particularly to new dungeon masters, but this applies equally well to players, is a fundamental principle of good writing, which is show, don't tell. And the way this shows up in role-playing games is that consistently, time after time, my experience has been that what shows up at the gaming table is far, far, far more memorable than anything you may have planned in text form to sort of reveal or speak or monologue about through a particular character. Showing your backstory, therefore, can be far more powerful than simply telling it or waiting around for the perfect moment to spring a bit of this extended novel that you've written on your fellow characters or players. So most DMs that I know can be really cool with you simply revealing past elements of your character's history on the fly. Now, you don't want to do this to kind of game the system. Oh yeah, by the way, I happen to have been raised by orcs, so now I should have, orc as a language. So you don't want to put any game mechanics behind this or necessarily make it crunchy or make it seem like you're using some made-up element of your backstory in the moment to drive gameplay aspects, but to drive story? Absolutely brilliant. So consider, first of all, the radical approach of a pretty much zero backstory approach to your character. Whole RPGs have been written on this principle that actually you're going to reveal over time what your character is about and what they've experienced in the past. And it's going to be a revelation even to you. After all, making stuff up is the Dungeon Master's single greatest secret. Why not let players borrow a leaf from that book as well? Okay, so maybe that's not for you. Maybe that's a little too radical in order to feel a bit more comfortable and frankly to kind of kickstart your understanding of your character. You do want some backstory. That's fair. That can work equally well. But here's the thing. One of the most key things to consider about your backstory, one of the main things that I look for as a dungeon master is this beautifully written D&D fanfic. It's what does this backstory tell me as a DM about what's going to motivate this character. You want your DM to understand what motivates your character because then your DM can throw out stuff that's going to lead you toward the good, interesting stuff that they've planned and prepared that makes for a more interesting story. You want them in a way to understand some of the levers or strings they can pull. You still have agency, you still have choices, obviously, within all of this, but knowing what motivates a character and in turn, what's going to make it interesting for a player to explore the different aspects of that character through the story as it unfolds is the absolute gold that we're mining for as DMs when we read a backstory. So, your family was killed by goblins and now you're a goblin hunter. pretty classic. But consider some of these other ones. For example, more subtle things like, as a kid, you were just always bullied, right? So now you have this trait of wanting to defend the weak and stick up for them, even perhaps in cases where those people being bullied maybe kind of deserve it. Or you came from poverty and now you're obsessed with wealth. So you can understand what seems like a kind of, superficial trait actually has some deep roots in early deprivation. Of the four, kind of elements of the character sheet that D&D 5e in particular provides, so that's the bonds, ideals, traits, and flaws, of those four, the most important to me is the flaw. Why? Because flawed characters are relatable characters in stories, in movies, and in role-playing games. Also, it once again gives me the opportunity to give you a chance to exhibit that flaw. And in my games, when you play to your flaw or any other trait, and it actually kind of imperils your character or in some way disadvantages you, but it's really what your character would do, you're going to get an inspiration point for that, because I feel that it's so important not to necessarily always go for ultimate success with the character, but to go for the character and what the character wants and what the character really would do. And in that sense, your backstory can start to inform some of your future decisions, but it needs to be kind of really distilled down, right? It needs to be the fundamental elements. And a character, or a player rather, that presents a character to me that basically says, here's a bullet point of a few things that happened and here's how that's going to motivate them, is a player that I absolutely am going to want to work with to flesh that out, to develop that at the table. And again, when it happens at the table, it's memorable, it's rich, it's in the moment, and everybody's going to enjoy that unfolding rather than just having a bunch of exposition, frankly, just dumped on them. Doesn't work in movies, doesn't work in role-playing games. So clearly what I'm saying is that less is more when it comes to your backstory, as long as it's the right sort of kind of less, if that makes sense. And one of the main reasons for this is psychological. There's this thing called sunk cost, where basically once you've invested in something, you want to capitalize on it or keep investing in that particular avenue, even if it's not necessarily paying off for you. As a result, I've seen players get into this thing where they're sort of sitting on these pages and pages of backstory, basically just waiting to reveal all the cool stuff they've thought up about their character. And frankly, it's like someone that's, having a conversation, just waiting for that moment to say the thing that they're going to want to say, whether or not it really applies to the conversation being had. So it's actually to your benefit, in much the same way it's to the benefit of dungeon masters, to sort of structure things lightly and loosely and be nimble. Because there is a kind of railroading that is trying to, steer things in a particular direction that even the players themselves can do when they get over-invested in their backstories. All right, so you're with me so far. You're bought into the idea that bringing out just certain key elements of the backstory as a starting point and being willing to do some improvising along the way is going to be a good route, essentially creating a sketch rather than this detailed masterpiece to get started with understanding your character. So now how do you do that? How do you actually reveal backstory elements as you go along? Well, there's another key from the literary world. Alongside show, don't tell is this idea of the telling detail. The telling detail is a way for you to, with a gesture or a phrase, be able to give insights into what your character is like without, again, having to unpack a ton of exposition. Now, nothing wrong with a bit of exposition. If you're in a quiet moment by the campfire prior to a long rest, great to maybe talk a little bit about your past. You're going to want to talk in character about that, of course, rather than just sort of reading off what you've written. But throughout the story and throughout the campaign, you can also drop these telling details. What is a telling detail? Well, that you nervously kind of fondle your jewelry because you're often actually lying. Or if you come from a noble background, maybe you're constantly cleaning off your clothing or sniffing a perfumed handkerchief to show your disdain for the unclean masses. Maybe there's a scar your character has that they just never talk about. And you know what? You don't have to know where that scar came from either. It's cool. It's mysterious. It's a telling detail about your character that you can start to build around, to build this rich three-dimensional persona that's going to feature time and again in these different episodes. So let it unfold over time. Let it unfold through showing rather than telling, through specific telling details. Because again, the most memorable aspects, and really in a way the only thing that's real, as it were, is kind of what the camera captures, is kind of what happens at the gaming table. Everything else is ancillary to that. And this is something that I constantly emphasize to fellow DMs as well. By over-preparing and presenting only a small portion of the material at the table, in a way, as long as it's fun for you, that's fine. But bear in mind, the most fun is sharing in all of this with others. My hope is that this has been useful to you and given you some practical ideas for how you can start to create more of a sketch-style backstory and interface with your DM in particular. Always run this stuff by your DM, clear it with them, work with them collaboratively on, what your character is going to be like as a starting point. And then, of course, bear in mind that character and that understanding of the character can and must evolve over time. Otherwise, what's the point of playing a game? You can just write a story. I hope this was useful to you. I hope that in future episodes, we can unpack more interesting aspects of how to be sort of your DM's favorite player. It's to your advantage. It's to the advantage of the entire group that you kind of take away some of these bag of tricks items and start to deploy them. I'm curious your thoughts, if you've tried any of this stuff, if it's worked, or if you've run into issues. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Until next time, happy gaming.